Prologue of A Crown for Joanna. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Therese. A Crown for Joanna by Sister Mary Jean Dorsey, O.P. Prologue. The Gossip of the Marketplace. February 1452. Rosa's fingers were too cold to be very swift at sorting the slippery little fish, even had she been interested in the process. Tia Carlotta had a sharp tongue, and her new assistant was not anxious to sample its edge, but it was hardly to be wondered at that her thoughts were elsewhere. Who could be expected to devote much attention to a basketful of sardines with such news in the air? Truly, it was not every day of the week that brought such excitement to Lisbon. Every church and convent tower in Portugal was pealing out the joyful news that a princess was born in the royal castle, and even in the miserable quarter of the city where the fish markets were, people were more interested in the good news than in their wares. Bawling cattle and bleating sheep from a nearby alley testified that other merchants, too, were neglecting their stalls. The narrow streets and even the flat rooftops were full of gesticulating people, all noisily repeating what they had heard, and paying little attention to whether anyone listened or not. "Joanna, that's a pretty name." Bits of gossip fluttered from tongue to tongue. "Joanna, after the holy Joanna de Aza." No, after St. John the Evangelist, to whom the Queen, God bless her, has great devotion. But no, it could not be. Did not Queen Isabella make a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Dominic's mother, praying for an heir to the throne? Joanna. Too bad it was a girl. A throne is always uneasy with a girl. Joanna. Rosa listened as she sorted the last of the fish, and picked up the flat basket to carry it over to Tia Carlotta. The cackling laugh of the old woman met her as she approached. "The fires of gossip burn bright to-day," she said. "Some one is sure to get scorched." "Too bad it wasn't a boy," said Rosa. "Then he would be king some day in his own right." Tia Carlotta shook her head. "No, child, it only appears that way. A prince may be fine, but a princess— ah, there's a valuable piece of property. What's a prince? He may be a good king, but he may also grow up to be an idler and spend his time following the hounds while his people starve. But a princess— you can trade a princess for a pretty bit of a kingdom if you're wise enough. Ah, yes," she shook her head sagely and cackled again, "the king will not mind that his heir is a daughter. You can manage a daughter." "You are very wise, Tia Carlotta," said the girl humbly. "I don't see how you know so much." "Humph," said the old woman. "I keep my eyes open. That's one good way to learn. There are many things that pass in the marketplace, more than in the palaces of kings. If you are smart enough to keep still and listen, you will hear much. If you talk much, you will hear little, and no one listens to what you say." Rosa laid the basket of sardines on the ground in front of them, and sat down with her back to the wall, pulling her ragged shawl closer about her against the chill. "For instance," continued Tia Carlotta, "when good weather comes, what will you see along that highway?" "Pilgrims," said Rosa. "That will be fun." Tia Carlotta grunted. "Not pilgrims only. Ambassadors will come from far countries— Spain, France, England, or maybe further still. They say there are places further away than England. They will gallop through the town in their trappings of gold and scarlet, scaring decent people and eating up all the food. And what will they want?" Her voice changed to a mincing whine. "The Sovereign of Castile does the very great honor of asking for the hand of the Princess of Portugal for his son Hernando, who will be 2 years old this Easter." Or, "The King of France requests the hand of the Princess Joanna for his most excellent brother, the Duke of Guienne." "Why, he's an old man," exclaimed Rosa indignantly, "and the Princess is only a baby. Even when she grows up he will be years and years older than she is." Tia Carlotta shrugged her shoulders. "I didn't say it was fair. I merely said that's what happens. They'll make the best match they can, and go back to their court congratulating themselves on the bargain they've struck. And when the princess is 6 or 7, she will go to a foreign court to learn their language and their ways, and forget she ever laid eyes on Portugal." "Suppose the Princess doesn't want to marry the one they pick out for her?" Rosa asked. The old woman laughed. "She probably won't, but it matters very little. A princess has even less to say about those things than other girls would have." "She will wear fine linens and soft silks from the land of the Great Khan," Rosa said to herself. "She will have jewels on every finger, and pearls for her hair, and fine foods to eat. But she will have to marry some one she has never seen before, some one who is perhaps years older or younger than she." Aloud she remarked, "I'm sure I couldn't be happy in her place." "You'll never have to," said Tia Carlotta shortly. "Fisher folk have problems enough trying to keep alive without worrying over the troubles of kings." "I feel sorry for her," Rosa insisted. "That won't help either of you," Tia Carlotta said. "Those things are expected of a princess, just as hunger and cold are expected of fisher folk. Some years there is a good run of fish and we have enough to eat. Some years there isn't, and our children starve. Some princesses have happy marriages and some don't. Why worry about them? They don't worry about us." "Queen Isabella is kind," said Rosa. "She is always kind to the poor." "Yes," Tia Carlotta agreed grudgingly. "But then that's what riches are for, to help those who are poor, and to give the rich a chance to practice charity. But it's few enough of them who care whether we live or die." A wine cart on loudly squealing wheels lurched down the narrow street below them. "There'll be gay celebrations for the rich," said Tia Carlotta sourly. Rosa was too cold to answer, and there seemed little to say, anyway. She sat hunched against the stall, her eyes following the stream of people surging in the street at the end of the alley where the fish markets were. No one wanted any fish to day, and of course there was "a good catch." Monks and shopkeepers and merchants and children pushed and hurried through the crowded street, apparently with no particular place to go, but noisily insisted on getting there. She brightened as George, a boy from a neighboring market, came running up the alley and dropped breathless beside her. "Guess what I saw," he gasped. "A dragon by the looks of you," said Tia Carlotta. "A herald," said George. "I ran after him for a long, long time. He is telling everyone to make ready, that all the nobles of the kingdom are coming, and there will need to be food and housing for them and their servants." "More work, no more money," grumbled an old woman from the next stall. "Always more work. We will have to go hungry ourselves so they can be fed. It's always the way." "Why are they coming here?" asked Rosa. George, almost bursting with importance, answered, "To pledge their loyalty to the Princess, so in case the king should die she would be their lawful ruler." "Then they're all come," cried Rosa. "It will be a great sight." "Nobles and bishops and archbishops and everything," said George, jumping to his feet. "I've got to go to find my father. He's going with the men to the provinces for fruit. Maybe I'll get to go too." He ran off shouting with excitement. Rosa settled back with a sigh against the stall. "I wish I were a boy, so I could go out to the provinces," she exclaimed. Tia Carlotta laughed. "Your princess probably would wish she were a boy too," she said. "A lot of good it does to wish." There was a loud shout from a nearby alley, the chatter of chickens, the sharp accent of scolding women. Around the corner ran three frightened hens, squawking and flapping their awkward wings. Almost on top of them ran a terrified calf, bawling. Behind the calf came a pell-mell procession of small boys. The chickens flapped themselves out of the way under a stall, and the calf, running into a corner, was caught by the boy in lead. The whole group ended up in a tangle almost on top of the sardine merchant. "What do you mean by this?" shrieked Tia Carlotta angrily. "Upsetting decent people's wares with your stupid animals. Get out, you and your calf." "It's Brother Jerome's calf," gasped the tall boy who was holding it. "He's bought three more," chimed in another boy. "This one got away." "So I see," said Tia Carlotta. "Well, get out anyway. Go find Brother Jerome." Just then Brother Jerome himself came puffing around the corner. He was a little stout, and the calf had given him a merry chase, so he stood for a moment wiping his forehead and trying to unwind the long black scapular that had twisted around him as he ran. With a great effort he regained his breath and addressed Tia Carlotta. "That calf, a very imp of the wicked one," he said. I wonder if it's safe to use this hide for the Princess's hour book." "Oh," said Rosa, "you bought him for vellum." "Yes," said Brother Jerome. "Brother Alvarez has worked for 6 years on a book of hours for some great benefactor. Now the Prior says he should finish it for the Princess. So I, poor Brother Jerome, must leave my poor silly sheep to look after themselves, while I go to market to buy an imp of a calf that runs away from me. Sheepskin would do for an ordinary book, but no, not for this one. The Prior says nothing but the finest vellum. So," he shrugged his shoulders, "vellum it is." "Will it be for one of those huge books like the ones in the cathedral?" asked Rosa. "The ones with the stories of the saints?" "No, no, child," said Brother Jerome, giving a firm hold on the calf. "That's not the style any more. It's for smaller and smaller books they're asking. One you can actually hold in your hand, imagine! And by the time the Princess, God bless her, is big enough to read it, Brother Alvarez will have it finished. It's a beauty, I tell you. You should see the Dixit page." "What's a Dixit page?" asked one of the little boys. Brother Jerome looked shocked. "Children are not taught their Latin any more," he said. "I don't know what the world is coming to. I really don't. The Dixit page, my young friend, is the page that begins the first psalm of the Vespers in the little office of Our Lady. 'Dixit Dominus Domino meo,' the Lord said unto my Lord. Ah, and Brother Alvarez's Dixit page, a jewel, a real jewel. It has the most beautiful angel on it, just like a real angel from heaven. And the blue in the background is superb. Such a fine blue, like the Madonna's own mantle. Only Brother Alvarez understands how to grind such a blue." "It must be very lovely," said Rosa. "It would be wonderful to know how to read." "It's a great responsibility to be a lettered person," said Brother Jerome, wagging his head. "May the Lord grant her to be a good ruler to her people." Since he had by now quite regained his breath, he turned his attention to the calf. "We must be on our way, my little friend with the fleet foot, if we want to get home before sundown. And you'd better be glad you've got energy to burn. You may have to pull old Brother Jerome up the hill. Good day, my friends, and God bless you all." He gave the calf a hearty prod and started down the alley, followed by the little boys. Rosa watched them until they were out of sight. "What a lot of excitement it causes for a princess to be born," she said. And around her the winds caught the bits of gossip and tossed them from stall to stall. "Joanna, that's a pretty name. The Queen is a saint, there is no doubt about it. It is her prayers that have won an heir to the throne. Joanna, Portugal has an heir. Joanna." End of prologue. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 1 of A Crown for Joanna by Sister Mary Jean Dorsey, O.P. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1 Pawn on a Chessboard of Kings. Joanna emerged from the mists of babyhood to find herself mistress of a vast domain. True, a son, Juan, had been born to the royal couple when Joanna was 3, but he was a sickly child, not apt to live to manhood, and the king's hopes were still fixed on his daughter. Joanna could well have been the most spoiled child in history, as, often enough, the children of royalty were insufferably spoiled. Portugal was great in the eyes of the nations, for Alfonso V was guardian of all the seas, by reason of Portuguese explorations, and his court teemed with representatives of far countries seeking permissions and privileges. Currying favor, they would not be blind to the opportunity offered by a charming small princess. They vied with one another in bringing her rich gifts, ivory, jewels, costly brocades, and cloth of gold, that had traveled the caravan route almost halfway around the world to Byzantium, and then crossed the sea to Venice to reach the Christian kingdoms. Toys and rich candies from the bazaars of the fabulous East, exotic plants for her gardens, beautiful tapestries for her walls, porcelain and jade from the land of the Great Khan. The little girl could not, of course, understand the great parchment map that hung in her father's hall, but she listened solemnly while the chaplain pointed out to her the Holy Land and Rome at the center of the world, and the lands from which her lovely jewels and dresses had come. It was hard to see how the blue water that gleamed just down the river from her father's castle could be the dark ocean, marked on the map as being full of strange dragons and frightful serpents. She was much more interested in the fact that so many people far away in those regions pointed out to her on the map by the chaplain had never heard of God. It was a certain thing they should be prayed for, and to a child as naturally devout as Joanna, that was all the invitation she needed to adopt them forthwith in her prayers. From her nurse, Donna Beatriz de Menez, she learned many pious practices and ways of pleasing God. The life and deeds of the holy Queen Isabel, Lily of Portugal, and those of the saintly Hungarian queens, Elizabeth and Margaret, were often related to the little girl. Others of her ancestors were more glittering in the pageant of history. But small Princess Joanna very early made choice of the example she would follow, and it was that of the family's saints. When baby Juan was a year old, the Queen died. All Portugal went into mourning for the good Queen, and Alfonso was desolate. The one who felt the loss perhaps more than any one else was Joanna. Overlooked by the busy adults of her household, as is the irritating way of adults, the little girl wandered disconsolately up and down the great halls and stairways. Her mother had gone to heaven, they told her, and one could not get to heaven simply by stepping out on the clouds, no, not even from the highest tower. Lonely and sad, Joanna sought out the chaplain. "I wish you would tell me about heaven," she said wistfully. "Heaven is where good people go when they die," said the chaplain. "God is there, and all the saints and angels. Didn't Donna Beatriz tell you that, little one?" "Yes," said Joanna. "Many times she tells me about heaven. But I want to know how to get there." "Bigger people than you are have wished they could answer that question," said the chaplain. "But come, let us go out in the garden and talk about it." As they walked down the garden path, they stopped to admire a beautiful peacock. It had been brought as a gift to the king, and was a special pet of Joanna, who never tired of watching the glittering green, gold, and blue of its plumage. "Why does Donna Beatriz say that some people are as proud as a peacock?" asked the Princess. "Because it walks so haughtily, like a person who is very proud," said the chaplain. "But it's only keeping its pretty tail off the ground," said Joanna, "and it can't help having a pretty tail. God made it that way." "You know, little Princess," said the chaplain, "the peacock is a symbol to believing Christians. You don't know what that word 'symbol' means, but a symbol is something that represents an idea. For instance, what does that crown of thorns embroidered on your sash mean?" "I embroidered it myself," said Joanna promptly. "Only, of course, Donna Beatriz fastened the threads for me. It makes me think of Jesus' sufferings." "And what does that lily mean, the one that is carved into the stone arch over there above the path?" "That means Our Lady, Mother of God, because she was so pure, like a lily." "That's right," said the chaplain. "The lily is a symbol of the Mother of God. The thorns are a symbol of Jesus' sufferings. Now the peacock is a symbol too. It is a symbol of the soul in heaven, beautiful with all the graces and virtues, shining with the glory God will give it when this life is over. So the peacock is a symbol of the good people who go to heaven." "And the blue, the glittery blue that changes color when the sun shines on it, that is the blue of Our Lady's dress," exclaimed the little girl. "Now, Father, please, how can I get to heaven?" "You must keep the commandments of God and those of the Church," said the chaplain, "and in order to do that well, you must love God more than earth or heaven or anything in it. You must love Him with all your heart, not just with the part of it that you can spare from other things." He smiled as Joanna looked puzzled. "That's too big an idea for a little girl," he said. "Come, sit down on this garden bench." "I do love God," said Joanna. "I want to love Him more." "That's right, little one," said the chaplain. "We should all love Him more. My little princess, this is a truth that many people do not like to hear. It costs to go to heaven. Not gold," he touched the gold filigree that nestled in her dark curls, "not ivory," he lifted the lovely ivory cross she wore on a jeweled chain around her neck, "not even cloth of gold from Cathay will buy it. It costs suffering. Little one, do you know what it means to suffer?" "Oh, yes, Father, like Jesus. He suffered," she said quickly. "Yes, Jesus suffered," said the chaplain, "but you have never suffered pain. You are suffering loneliness now because you miss your good mother. But it cost you pain and loneliness and sorrow of heart to buy heaven. But it's worth it," he added with a smile, as she looked at him seriously. "It has to hurt to get to heaven," said Joanna to herself half aloud. "I must suffer to go there. See, Father, I am going to be like the peacock some day in heaven." The chaplain would have smiled, but she was very serious as she continued. "He even has a crown. I shall have a crown too, because I am a princess, but I want a crown of thorns like Jesus wore." The chaplain sighed as he rose to go. "I think you will have one, little princess," he said, "but remember, thorns will hurt." He went thoughtfully down the path to the chapel. Without further ado, Joanna threw all her energy into the project of being a saint. She was a person of very ardent temperament, possessed of great spiritual energy for all her frailty of body. It was not long until all who came in contact with her were aware that here was a child who had both a goal and the methods of reaching it very firmly outlined in her small head. Even the pious Donna Beatrice was astonished at the penances adopted by the little girl. There seemed no limit to the punishment she would inflict on her delicate body if someone did not stop her. 2 of her ladies in waiting and a faithful old manservant were enlisted as her accomplices in holiness. She persuaded one of them to get her a scourge of little ropes, and then made the ladies take turns in standing outside her door, watching the hall lest her father come in unexpectedly and find her beating herself for the sins of Portugal. She fasted severely on Fridays and every other time that she dared to do so. At night, after Donna Beatrice was asleep, Joanna would slip noiselessly out of the big canopied bed and sleep on the floor. She even tried to get possession of a hair shirt, but this was firmly denied until she should be older. She countered by being even more severe with herself in the matter of food. Joanna, in spite of her penances, was a very normal little girl. She played in the royal gardens with Leonora de Menez, the little daughter of Donna Beatrice, and with the children of the other court attendants. They played the games children always have played in one form or another, made small shrines in the garden, went on make-believe voyages to convert the hordes of the Great Khan, pilgrimaged to Jerusalem, dramatized the lives of the saints which were read to them daily from the big parchment books in the royal library. As they learned to say the divine office, they pretended they were nuns, cloistered in the rose arbor, chanting the praises of God. Joanna was still quite young when the question of her marriage arose. Children, particularly royal children, were often betrothed by the time they were 7. But Alfonso was slow to consider any plan that would take Joanna away from him. Perhaps he would not admit even to himself that it was her precocious wisdom that guided many of his actions, that he depended upon her, as he once had upon her mother, for a firmness of character which he lacked. He did not look seriously upon any of the proposals until the opportunity came for an alliance with the ruling house of France. This would be of great diplomatic advantage to Portugal. Still, he consulted Joanna in the matter. She wisely pointed out to him that Juan was still delicate, and that her removal to another country would put the succession in danger. He agreed, sent his regrets to the French, and smiled with approval on Joanna's discretion. But this was merely the beginning. Joanna knew it would go on and on until she would have to decide definitely. She felt obliged to tell her father that she had other plans. Her heart was set on entering the convent. Alfonso was stunned at this news. He was a pious man, and his wife had been popularly called a saint. He admired Joanna's piety, indeed anybody's piety, but he had no intention of giving up to the religious life the daughter whose prudent marriage would enrich and enlarge the kingdom of Portugal. So he gave her an absolute refusal. Joanna was not at all discouraged, though she was disappointed. She and Leonora had prepared for just this to happen. The idea of a religious vocation was not a thing that had occurred to either of them overnight. They had prayed and planned for years, and in so doing had soberly considered all the obstacles. Leonora had, by various journeys, taken stock of the convents in the kingdom, to find out which offered the best chance for them to live a life of austere retirement and absolute devotion to God. They had decided on the convent of the Dominicans at Aveiro. But both of them knew the practical difficulties that lay in the way of their hopes. Treating the matter as a childish whim, or at most as an annoying notion that must be given time to lose its attraction, Alfonso ignored it. Joanna did not. She was wise enough not to say anything more to her father, but there was a Father to whom she had much to say about it. She faced her problem squarely, rosary in hand. Prayer, she knew, was a weapon, a battering ram for the most obstinate walls. It would shatter every obstacle to the attainment of her goal. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 2 of A Crown for Joanna by Sister Mary Jean Dorsey, O.P. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 2. A Question of Thrones. King Alfonso hated complications. Perhaps these did not bother other empire plotters, who might even have enjoyed arranging the human pawns that went into the game of royal marriages. But to Alfonso it had always seemed a sad fact that sooner or later, in the intricate game of playing both ends against the middle, one got caught between, and had to endure the pinching. At least he himself was singularly gifted at getting so caught. He found himself in just such a predicament on the day in Joanna's 18th year, when he realized that whichever ambassador he answered in the affirmative, there would be not one, but two angry delegations departing from his court. He was overlooking the fact that there would also be a third participant in the affair who would be very much put out over the decision, whatever it should be, and that was Joanna herself, about whose marriage the whole question had arisen. Perhaps, having three determined delegations to satisfy, buy off, or at least pacify, Alfonso felt there was simply too much at stake to consider the taste of the princess. Joanna was a woman now, no longer the frail child who asked nothing but to be allowed to pray. The finished product of the finest court training, robed in the riches of a fabulous age. She made a picture whose fame had gone to the farthest courts of Europe. Her determination to remain unmarried, to go, in fact, to a convent and spend her life in obscurity, was so foreign to the ideas of the court that no one seriously considered it. She who might, if her father were wise enough, rule from almost any throne in the Christian world, adding who knew what luster to the name of Portugal, should never be allowed to give up her career for the convent. Alfonso had, it is true, given her a reluctant consent after long pleading on her part, but he felt that she would eventually forget her inconvenient desire if he but put her off long enough. To Joanna the whole thing was marvelously simple. She belonged to God. From her earliest years she had wanted nothing else but God, and even amid the noise of the court she had always listened for His voice. Had she been the only heir to the throne, there might have been the question of her duty to her country, but Juan was the crown prince, and the throne would be his and his children's. There remained her father's ambitions for extending Portugal's dominions by a discreet marriage for his daughter. But what was that in face of her higher vocation to be a spouse of Christ? Spiritual counsel had pointed out to her that for the present her only path was that of obedience to her father. Somehow, in God's good time, she would be allowed to follow the path of her choice. So on the morning when she was summoned to her father's presence, after the three ambassadorial parties had been entertained for some time and were beginning to wear out their welcome, her mind was made up. The king might be concerned with which one of the three proposed suitors she would marry. Joanna's solution was far from simple. She would marry none of them. However, Joanna had not lived so many years in the midst of court intrigues without absorbing the fine art of diplomacy. She robed herself in her richest garments, as her father would wish her to do, and presented herself as befitted the princess of a great kingdom. As she stood, demure and with downcast eyes, before her father, she was the very image of frailty against the glittering background of warriors and diplomats. She curtsied gracefully and stood silently before the king. In her simplest robes she was regal. In the gleaming splendor of court dress she was something to make her father beam with pride. He inclined his head to acknowledge the greeting. "My daughter, the Princess Joanna," he said proudly, "of all my treasures, the greatest." "A pearl of great price, to be sure," said the ambassador of Maximilian, King of the Romans. "Little wonder that all the Christian kingdoms envy the court of Portugal." "As you are aware," Alfonso continued, "I am more deeply attached to my daughter than another father might be, because she is the image of her saintly mother, who has been dead so many years. I can hardly bear her out of my sight, as you can well understand, and honored as I am by the most excellent princes who seek her hand, I am loath to let her go." The French ambassador made a deep bow. "One can well understand, your Majesty," he said, "how it would pain you to see the Princess go far away. How much kinder it would be to both of you to know that she reigns from the throne of your sister kingdom of France." Alfonso glanced at Joanna. She had not quivered an eyelash, but he suddenly had an uneasy recollection that the girl had begged his consent to enter the convent. And yes, he had consented, come to think of it, but of course that was absurd. There had been no question at the time of an alliance with France, England, or the King of the Romans. Surely Joanna would understand that. He went on hastily. "It is because of this very great love for my daughter that I waive a father's right to choose a husband for his child. Joanna herself shall choose which one of these most estimable princes should be her lord. It must," he directed the remark to Joanna, "it must be one of the three." Joanna's lashes flickered briefly, and she curtsied again. "As you wish, my father," she said. "It shall be one of the three." "Our brother monarchs have conferred great honors on Portugal," he continued, "and you are fully aware that in accepting any one of them you will bring great joy to our people and honor to the kingdom." Joanna's dark eyes looked into his with that disconcertingly direct gaze that so often shook his strongest resolutions. "My father speaks truly, that it is a momentous choice," she said. "I must, therefore, pray fervently for light to do the will of God. For one must never take such an important step without God's blessing." "Naturally, naturally," said Alfonso, somewhat too hastily. "One would not expect to make any such decision without prayer." "Certainly not," agreed the ambassador from England. "The Princess is pious as well as beautiful," said the French ambassador, "a combination one finds, alas, very rarely these days." "I shall pray until I reach a decision," said Joanna matter of factly. "It will, of course, take several days." "Of course," echoed Alfonso, since there was nothing else to say. "If I may withdraw?" Joanna asked. She curtsied again, and turned to go down the deep carpeted hall, followed by the admiring eyes of the entire assemblage. A ripple of whispers passed from person to person behind jeweled fans and ruffs of Flemish lace. "She is even more beautiful than people say she is, even more pious," and they might have added, even more wise. Alfonso was in high spirits. He knew that he was not very clever, and matching wits with some of the finest plotters of Europe was wearying. There were, for example, the Spider King, Louis XI of France, and the practised veterans in the neighboring court of Castile. But for once, Alfonso told himself, he had made a good move, and one which extricated him from an embarrassing position. He breathed easily for the first time in weeks, laughed heartily at quips that were not at all funny, dispensed several benefices that he would later wish he had left in his own treasury, and settled down for Joanna to reach a decision. He could hardly have hoped, he told himself, that she would be so sensible. Joanna knew very well the workings of a diplomat's mind, and she did not for a moment entertain the delusion that her father's love alone had given over to her the final decision. She knew that all three offers had about them certain advantages which Alfonso could ill afford to lose. But in accepting one he would inevitably anger the other two. It would pay him to buy off the possibility of a war with France by accepting the terms of the Spider King. But the English had not yet forgotten the long 100 years of war with France, and to anger England meant that he would have no ally against Castile when he was ready to make war upon it. He looked with longing eyes at an alliance with England. He had been trying to negotiate one for a long time, but it would never do to anger both Maximilian and Louis XI at the same time, as one border was all that one could reasonably be expected to defend at a given moment. He was in somewhat the same position as the man with the fox, the goose, and the sack of corn, who could take only one across the river at a time, and had to be careful which two he left together. But in leaving the decision to Joanna he had committed a master stroke. He would now have the alliance of whichever prince she chose, and surely no nation could be angered if a slip of a girl had chosen against them. In her own apartments Joanna set about divesting herself of the court finery. She took off the stiff cloth of gold gown, the heavy necklace, and the glittering rings. Donna Leonora unfastened the high piled hair and unlaced the pearl strings that glistened white against its darkness. Joanna, who had not spoken since she left the court room, looked up at her friend with a tired smile. Tears welled up in Leonora's eyes. "It isn't fair," she said. "He knows what you want to do." "I know," replied Joanna. "Sometimes it is very hard to see God's will under the cloak of human commands. Right now I am bound to obey my father; but I am sure that if God wants me to be a religious, He will find a way, finally, for me to do so." She smiled at Lenora. "Some day, still, you and I will walk together down the cloister halls at Aveiro, and serve God there in peace." Lenora returned the smile, but her face soon sobered. "It is pleasant to dream," she said. "But here you are faced with a decision that, no matter how you settle it, will make impossible your greatest hopes. What are you going to do?" "Pray," said Joanna. Lenora regarded her friend with reverence. She knew what wonderful things were said of the Princess's prayers. She had indeed witnessed some remarkable things herself, but it was still a bad situation. "You're asking for a miracle," she said. "If God wants me to be a religious, and I think He does," said Joanna again, "then nothing that the world can do will keep me from it." Lenora took out of the press the simple dress of blue camlets that Joanna preferred to all the gowns of velvet and brocade and cloth of gold. Helping Joanna to put it on, she pursed her lips in a silent exclamation. Under the lovely linens that were the mark of royalty, Joanna punished her delicate skin with a rough hair shirt. Lenora knew it was only one of the many mortifications she practiced. No wonder her prayers were so powerful. Joanna retired to her private oratory to pray. From far below came the sounds of revelry, where the ambassadors were amusing themselves in the courtyard of the palace. Nearer was the continuous twitter of the swallows that nested in the stone fretwork above the chapel windows; but Joanna, whose heart was far away in prayer, heard neither. She was listening too intently for the sound of a loved voice. 2 days later, when the King had begun to show signs of weariness under the constant necessity of entertaining the ambassadors, and the uneasy doubt concerning Joanna's reaction, he was vastly relieved to hear that the Princess had reached her decision. Gleefully he summoned the ambassadors to the hall. Joanna looked none the worse for her long vigil, approached and curtsied. "You have made your decision, my child?" asked Alfonso. "Yes, Father," she said, "and it is one that cannot easily be changed. I have set my heart upon it." "No one shall make you change it," said Alfonso. "Who is the Prince of your choice?" "I find, after long prayer and consideration," answered Joanna, "that I could be happy with no one but the Dauphin of France. Therefore he, if he is still living, is my choice." She paused for a moment while the French delegation looked at one another in incredulous delight. The Dauphin was physically ugly; his reputation was even more sinister. How could this lovely girl make such a choice? They could not understand, either, her last remark before she withdrew: "If he is no longer living, then I consider myself free to follow a desire which I have expressed to my father and sovereign." The two disappointed delegations soon set out for another court; and soon the French ambassadors, with their long train of servants, set out gleefully for France. The King and Princess Joanna watched from the battlements as they rode out of sight. "When they return, my dear," said the King, "it will be to take you as a bride to France." 2 weeks later Alfonso received the news that the Dauphin had died, a week before Joanna had so confidently announced her choice. How much had she known of this, and by what means? Alfonso would most certainly like to know, but he did not dare to ask any questions. When the news reached the court of Portugal, Joanna proceeded as though nothing now stood in the way of her going to the convent. She gave away her gowns, her jewels, even some of her books. She and Lenora spent long hours busily packing her trousseau for the much desired bridal, and they wrote to Aveiro asking the prayers of the Sisters that they should be successful in their plan. Joanna pointed out to her father that it must certainly be the will of God that she go to the convent, as she had been freed from her promise by the Dauphin's death. The preparations might have been completed without hindrance had it not been for Juan. He was old enough now to think himself capable of a man's decisions, and he had no notion of letting Joanna go to the convent. Consequently, when he found what she was doing, he went storming to the King; and Alfonso, who hated trouble, forbade her to go in spite of the permission he had already given. In the end Joanna told Lenora not to wait any longer for her, but to go ahead to Aveiro, and there to pray that soon all obstacles might be removed. Lenora rode away one day, down the valley and out of sight, leaving on the parapet of the castle a slim figure in royal robes, sobbing her grief to the cold stone walls. Alfonso grumbled to see his daughter so poorly dressed, and insisted that new gowns be ordered to replace the ones she had given away. He gave her many rich presents, beautiful jewels and costly fabrics, in a clumsy but well meant attempt to make up to her for what she had lost. Juan strutted about with an insufferable air of importance, giving her advice at every opportunity. The princess responded with truly regal poise, by saying nothing. She only prayed longer and more intensely, fasted more, punished herself more rigorously. If heaven must be taken by force, then she would storm the very walls until they fell to her prayers. Her faith was not misplaced, for in little more than a year she had her answer. Two things happened in the year 1471 that had fortunate consequences for Joanna. One was the discovery of gold within the Portuguese possessions, which greatly replenished the depleted royal treasury, and had a corresponding good effect on the king's disposition. The other was the summoning of Christian kings to a crusade against the Moors. For 800 years the Moors had ravaged the peninsula. Yearly they made daring incursions into the Christian communities, burning and killing. Christians had fought bravely but unsuccessfully to rid themselves of this menace, and from time to time an army was called together to make war upon them. It was such a crusade which was called into being in 1471, and Alfonso was asked to lead a large body of troops across to Africa. For all his lack of decision in affairs of state, Alfonso was brave in the field, and he joined the crusade with great enthusiasm. By his side, resplendent in his first war armor, rode Juan. Reigning in his place on the throne of Portugal was Joanna. Wise and kind Joanna had always been, and her friends knew it well. Now the whole kingdom had a chance to sample that wisdom and kindness. When Alfonso returned victorious, glorying in his new title of the African, his people were as loud in their praise of Joanna's goodness as they were of his own prowess. All in all, he was in a beneficent mood. Joanna, being a woman, saw her advantage and took it. She chose a time when Juan was elsewhere, and began by reminding Alfonso how proud all Christendom was of his mighty deeds, and of his courage and piety in such a cause. Yes, Alfonso agreed, it had been a very fortunate victory. Joanna then reminded him that it was, as always in a crusade, God's victory, and to God belonged the glory. Yes, said her father, that was true. He owed it all to God. One should make a sacrifice as a thank offering, pursued Joanna, reminding him of Noah's act of worship on coming from the ark. For such a victory, moreover, nothing but a well-loved victim would do. Alfonso asked what she would advise. Her answer had been ready for years. Herself. Outflanked by her arguments, and piously grateful for the victory, Alfonso agreed. Before either he or Juan could recover from the surprise attack, Joanna, who had been ready to leave at a moment's notice, was on her way to the convent. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 3 of A Crown for Joanna by Sister Mary Jean Dorsey, O.P. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3 The Long Road to Aveiro. The victory over the king was not gained so easily after all. In the first place, the convent to which Alfonso allowed his daughter to go was not that of her choice but of his. The monastery of Dominicans at Aveiro, where the austerity prescribed by the holy founder was still fervently observed, was considered an unsuitable place for a royal applicant because of its social unimportance. The Dominicans had been in Portugal for 200 years, but they still were rigorous in their poverty, and, like the parents of one Thomas of Aquino 2 centuries before, Alfonso did not want his daughter to join an order of mendicants. So he sent her to the royal abbey of Bernardines at Audiobooks. Here most of the sisters were themselves of noble lineage, and they were delighted to have their princess as a companion. She was established in the guest house with her 4 ladies in waiting, and 2 of the Bernardine sisters to act as secretaries. This, for a soul who wanted nothing more than poverty and obscurity, and the chance to serve God in humble duties and in solitary prayer. Joanna had barely arrived at Audiobooks when a brilliant cavalcade was seen winding up the narrow streets from the south. In the lead was a sullen youth on a splendid black horse. Juan. Joanna sighed. Trouble. but her heart almost stopped beating when she saw the heavy, much overdressed lady who descended from the woman's carriage at the center of the caravan. It could be no one but Aunt Philippa. Aunt Philippa was a relative of her father's, who appeared on the scene with amazing rapidity whenever there was excitement in the air. She was, like so many others who cannot manage their own homes, a born matchmaker and meddler in general, and she scented trouble among her kinsfolk almost before they were themselves aware of it. Between family crises she amused herself with her friends' business, but always when anything interesting happened in any branch of the family she could be counted on to put in an appearance. To Joanna, who already had her father and brother to deal with, the arrival of Aunt Philippa was almost more than she could bear. She greeted her courteously, as was expected of a young relative. Aunt Philippa was effusive. "My dear, dear niece," she cried, kissing Joanna warmly, "I couldn't believe it when they told me you were here. I said, 'I'll have to see it for myself.' Why didn't you send for me, dear? What a dull place for you, the pride of the family. Where on earth did you get the idea of coming here? Or was it your father's notion?" "It was my own wish," said Joanna, "and the call of God." "Ah, but my child," Aunt Philippa wagged her jeweled forefinger knowingly, "God placed you on a throne. He never meant for you to hide away. You have just been reading a lot of those silly old stories about the saints. My dear, somebody ought to do something about it. Why, the day of saints is over long ago. The idea of your wasting your young life here with these dull people pursuing a worn out notion." "I don't pretend I'm a saint, Aunt Philippa," explained Joanna patiently. "I just have my heart set on being one, some day, and this is a good place to do it." "Well, that's a nice idea, and all that," admitted Aunt Philippa condescendingly, "but you mustn't worry about it. Ugh, going around with a black veil wrapped around you, thinking gloomy things, and looking mournful. Why, you're young and pretty, if I do say it myself. The women in our family have always been good looking. You can worry about those things when you get old. Then will be time enough to pray. Look at me. Do I look as if I stayed awake nights worrying over being a saint?" Joanna had to admit that she didn't. "So come now," coaxed Aunt Philippa. "Be a good girl. You were always such a good, obedient little girl, Joanna. Come, get your cloak, and come home with me. Your poor father is simply beside himself with the very thought of your being here." "I am sorry to oppose you, Aunt Philippa," said Joanna, "but I am sure it is the will of God that I serve Him in religion." "Ah, but I am not so sure," said Aunt Philippa, looking very wise. "You must leave it to me, child. I said to your father, 'You men don't know a thing about a young girl's heart, and this proves it. Now you and Juan just stay out of this and let me handle it. I've had experience in things like this. Joanna has always been just the dearest little friend of mine, and I know exactly what she wants.' That's what I said to him, so he let me talk to you alone. Now," she dropped her voice to a confidential whisper, "you must leave it to me. I'll have a fine, handsome young man for you in no time at all. I have just the very one in mind." Joanna started to protest, and Aunt Philippa hurried on. "Don't tell me, dear. I know just how you feel. I don't blame you for running off to the convent to escape those doddering old clowns your poor dear father wanted you to marry. That Frenchman! Ugh! They say his own brother poisoned him because he was so disagreeable. Men don't understand those things. You just leave it to your Aunt Philippa." Joanna sighed. What was the use trying to explain to a person who did not realize that there were spiritual values, let alone respect them? "I don't think you quite understand, Aunt Philippa," she said. "I don't want to marry, ever. I want to consecrate myself to God." "Yes, of course that's the way you think you feel, dear," said Aunt Philippa indulgently. "All young girls get these romantic streaks. They soon recover. Poor dear, you haven't really had the right training. I've neglected you, I know. I should have paid more attention to you since your darling mother died, but I'll make up for it now. I truly will, dear. I'm taking a house here in Olivella's, where I can be near you in this difficult time, and I know we can work something out together." A bewildered and worried Joanna watched the cavalcade turn down into the town. She had but one consolation. Aunt Philippa never stayed with any one thing very long. She would soon tire of the dull life of Olivella's, and long for the gaiety of her own circle. Of course, there was the very real possibility that everyone else would tire of Aunt Philippa long before then. In this she was quite correct. For 2 arduous months Aunt Philippa took up her stand daily in the convent parlor, to use all the arguments she could frame on the unfortunate girl. Eventually Joanna gave up trying to present her case, and the affair resolved itself into an endurance contest. Nothing could weaken Joanna's resolution, but the conflict upset her nervously, and she was further disturbed because Aunt Philippa and her numerous noisy followers daily upset the discipline of the house, and kept everything in a perpetual state of emergency. At last, in desperation, she wrote to her father, asking if she could go to another convent at a greater distance to have some respite from Aunt Philippa. In preparation for this, she wished to return to the court. Alfonso was delighted. He felt that she had probably had enough of convent life, and would be ready to return to court for good. But a few minutes' conversation with her when she returned dissipated this hope. She was more than ever determined to go to Aveiro, and Aunt Philippa's interference was just one more argument with which he had to sympathize. Alfonso refused to let her go to the Dominicans. He pleaded that her health was much impaired by her stay at Odivella's. She could never stand the rigorous life of Aveiro, but he did allow her to go to the convent of the Poor Clares at Coimbra. From there it would be possible for her to take a part in the affairs of the kingdom. Regretful, but glad at least of this concession, Joanna prepared for another long journey, and very shortly they were on the road again. This time the king wished it known that he approved of his daughter's choice. Rather, he disregarded her choice, and gave his blessing to what was in reality his own plan. Why he approved of even this is not quite clear. Perhaps his conscience was bothering him, or perhaps there were murmurs from the people, who loved Joanna very dearly, that he was being too harsh with the girl. Whatever his reason, he conducted his daughter in true royal style along the road to Coimbra. The long procession of attendants were gaily dressed, and there were merrymakers and the sound of musical instruments. Joanna's heart was heavy. She must have been able to see through her father's motives. In any case, she was grieved that he had so misunderstood her own. So on the road, one day out of Lisbon, she made a last attempt to win her point. Tomorrow the road would divide, she told her father. One road led to Coimbra, one to Aveiro, but only one to her happiness. She threw herself on her knees and begged him to take her to Aveiro. After long pleading he gave in, and in the morning they took the road to her chosen home. Juan was furious. He would have turned back, but dared not openly oppose his father. So in stubborn silence he rode along, plotting to overthrow her plans. Sister Leonora could hardly believe her eyes when Joanna stood before her and assured her she was at last to be permitted to enter the convent of her choice. They had dreamed and prayed so long for this day's coming that when it actually came they could hardly believe it. On August 4th, feast of the holy founder St. Dominic, Joanna heard Mass with her father and brother, and afterwards was taken into the cloister. The king insisted on treating the whole affair outwardly as a whim of the princess. They should humor her, he said, and it would pass off like any other girlish fancy. He made royal gifts to the convent, and then, with the sulking Juan beside him, sighed and rode away. For Alfonso knew by now that the princess was a woman of her word. He might treat the affair only as a whim, to relieve the anxiety of the court, but Joanna did not act upon whims. She was gone, and gone for good. And Alfonso, who loved his daughter, was sad. Rumors drifted back to Joanna of the uproar in the court when it became known that she intended to stay at Aveiro. Juan had put on mourning as though his sister were dead, and Lelli insisted that he was not going to shave until she came back to the court. "I am afraid he will have quite a beard," said Joanna to Sister Leonora, "for this is my rest for ever and ever. Here will I dwell, for I have chosen it." "I hope that is true," said Leonora to herself, "but somehow I am afraid. The world is a bitter foe." End of Chapter 3. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 4 of A Crown for Joanna by Sister Mary Jean Dorsey, O.P. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 4 A Gown for a Princess. It was the feast of the Conversion of St. Paul, 1478. 2 years before, in the neighboring kingdom of Spain, Isabella had been crowned Queen of Castile, amid the noisy acclamations of the crowd and in sight of all the world. In white brocade and ermine she ascended her throne, and the glare of noonday was made bright by the glittering pageant of color for which that age was famous. But it was quietly and in the silence of the night that Joanna went to her espousals. 3 years she had waited, not daring to take the step, and when at last she felt that it was safe to do so, she was now nearly 24 years old, and one seemed likely to live. It was done quietly, with no outward pomp to call down upon her head the maledictions of her father and brother. In the quiet of midnight, after matins, the community gathered in the chapel hall to admit Joanna as one of themselves. The still and lovely things of the spirit thrive best in silence anyway. It was with an unearthly joy that Joanna stood at last as bride before the community to which she begged admission as a novice. The faithful Lenora had dressed her for her bridals, as she would have robed her in priceless fabrics for an earthly lord, had that been Joanna's choice. The long dark hair was brushed simply back and held with a veil. Her gown was white, symbolic of innocence, but in no way more elaborate than that worn by any other postulant might be. Before God one is not princess or peasant, Joanna reflected as she stood waiting to enter the chapel hall. One is not princess or peasant. One is — she drew a deep breath at the very thought of it — his spouse. "Enter, bride of Christ." The chaplain's voice woke her from her reverie. The novice mistress was waiting by the door. Joanna walked beside her the long length of the chapter hall, dim now in the flickering light of candles, and prostrated herself on the floor. "What do you desire?" continued the chaplain. The request was ancient, Joanna knew; yet in the chaplain's voice on this solemn night it seemed as though for all eternity it had been meant only for her. So it was with great happiness that she responded, "God's mercy and yours." "Arise," commanded the chaplain. She rose and knelt before the chaplain, and for a moment he could not go on. Usually one paused here to ask the candidate if she realized what her renunciation meant, if she really wished to go on with it. But there was no need to ask the radiant postulant before him now whether she understood. She knew only too well, and better than he himself, what she was renouncing. He read the prescribed prayers, the novice mistress removed the girl's veil, and he cut swiftly through the dark locks. Heads might come off for this night's doing, he reflected uneasily. Joanna listened raptly to the prayers said as each piece of the habit was given into her hands. The white habit — may you deserve to walk clothed in white with Jesus Christ in His heavenly kingdom. The scapular — this special pledge of Our Lady's love to the order of friars preachers. The cincture of chastity, the veil of modesty, Our Lady's rosary, and last of all the crucifix. God forbid, my daughter, that you should glory in aught but the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. Sister Lenora went with her to a nearby room where the princess's robes were laid aside, and she was dressed as a Dominican sister. She caressed the folds of the habit, laid a loving hand on the long rosary. She had wanted them for so long. "We must hurry, sister." The novice mistress looked in anxiously from the door. "Isn't it beautiful?" Joanna whispered, her eyes shining. "It ought to be beautiful, designed by the Queen of Heaven," said Lenora. "Hold still so I can pin your veil. There now," she finished, "you're all ready. Here is the candle you carry in your left hand, and here is the crucifix for the other." As she watched her friend return to the chapel hall robed as a religious, Sister Lenora's eyes were filled with tears. They were happy tears, but there was pity too. Not many knew as she did what this decision would cost Joanna. "Henceforth in religion your name shall be Sister Joanna of the Crown of Thorns." The new novice turned from the chaplain and took her place in the community. Her face was radiant, her heart too full for song. The community began the Te Deum, and her heart followed the words of triumph. Sorrow and bitterness and angry words she would meet on the morrow, but to-night there was only joy. Was she not, at long last, the bride of Christ? Sister Joanna did not go to her bed on returning to her cell. She was much too excited to sleep. She stood by the open casement, heedless of the cold winds from the ocean, her eyes reflecting the stars that shone brightly through the lattice window. A bride of Christ, after how long? At least 18 years since the very dawn of reason, when she had vowed herself to God alone. and for at least 8 of those years she had prayed and worked and begged for the privilege of wearing the habit which now was hers. It was fragrant with the sanctity of thousands of wearers, that habit. Courageous men and women of a dozen nations had bled and died for the standard of truth it represented. It seemed almost too good to be true, that at last she, Joanna, could wear it too. She well knew that as soon as the peacefully sleeping city of Aveiro heard that she was wearing the religious habit, there would be trouble from the court. But as the stars were paling for the dawn, Sister Joanna smiled a tired smile and went to her bed for a few minutes of rest. A battle there definitely was ahead of her, but she was not alone. By her side she felt the sisterly courage of St. Catherine of Siena, who had been so strong in the face of great trials, of St. Margaret of Hungary, her own distant relative, and like herself the daughter of a king, of Blessed Diana de Andalo, and of the many other brave women who had worn worthily the habit she loved. Joanna prayed humbly and fervently for help from these, for help to be a good religious, to wear well that lovely habit, and, this most of all, to do God's will. The roads were very bad in February, but rumor needed no roads. In a remarkably short time a frightened messenger brought word to the convent that Prince Juan was approaching Aveiro, his face like a thundercloud, his horse lashed to foam. The sisters were terrified, and Joanna, who knew the violence of her brother's temper, was equally afraid of what he might do. Before she could arrive at any plan of action, the cloister door was thrown open with an unseemly bang, and Juan was striding noisily down the corridor towards her. Because he was very angry, and also because the religious habit and a recent illness had changed Joanna's appearance, he did not at first recognize his sister. When he did, he stared at her unbelievingly. "You are to come home with me," he said shortly. "We will have no more of this nonsense. You are a spectacle to the whole kingdom." "Please be so kind as to come to the parlor, Juan," she said with a calmness she did not feel. "We do not speak here in the cloister." "I speak where I please," he shouted. "I am the son of the King of Portugal." "This house belongs to the King of Heaven," she said quietly. Juan could hardly speak for rage, and the frightened nuns, looking on from the end of the corridor, were too terrified to help Joanna, even if she had called on them. He was, after all, the Crown Prince of Portugal and the son of their ruler. They wrung their hands and prayed as his angry shouts echoed down the arches beneath which there never before had been heard more than the click of a rosary or the patter of quiet feet. "You are a fool," he shouted, shaking his fist in Joanna's face, "thinking you will hide here and enjoy peace at the cost of all peace. You!" He paused to wither her with a glance, and was still more annoyed to see that Joanna did not cringe, only listened politely. "You, the Princess of Portugal, born for the throne, you who should be a light to your people, not hiding under a bushel in this ridiculous place." Joanna's eyes flickered with momentary amusement. "I am pleased to see that you have been reading Scripture, Juan," she said. "Did you happen to come across the passage, 'Seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God'? Mind the things that are above, not the things that are on earth?" Juan glared at her in helpless fury. "You are making fools of us all," he exclaimed. "You, standing there in that foolish garb. Take it off at once." Joanna looked down at her much loved habit, that garment she had wanted more than all the fine fabrics of earth. "I can never make you understand, Juan, how much I love it," she said. "Portugal protests," he said. "I protest. You have a duty to the kingdom. Your life belongs to Portugal, not to you." "My life belongs to neither," she said. "It belongs to God. And Portugal, which I love as much as you do, is more in need of prayers than of a princess right now. I shall serve my country here while I also serve my God." Juan's riding boots clicked loudly on the flagstones as he tramped back and forth, angrily formulating speeches. Joanna stood quietly watching him. Her heart was pounding wildly in spite of her calm exterior, and beneath her scapular her hand was clasped tightly around her crucifix. But a princess was trained not to show her feelings, and no outward sign betrayed her agitation, nor the anguished prayers that were pouring from her heart. The prince ceased his pacing, and his long sleeve swung sharply as he stood directly in front of her. "Take it off," he demanded. Joanna's eyes glinted in royal pride. "You are not my sovereign." He knew it was true, but she knew, and he knew that she knew, that he could, if he would, force her to obey. "I'll give you one more chance," he threatened. "If you do not take it off, I will tear it from you." Eyes and wills locked in combat. Joanna's was the stronger character, but physical strength favored him. "You will never be blessed for touching with violence anything consecrated to God," she said. "And you expect to be blessed in disobeying the King?" He said, and his eyes watched her narrowly. "You are not the King," she pointed out, "and I obey the King of Kings." With a sudden rush of anger he clutched the long white veil and pulled it from her head. Joanna, after the first involuntary gasp of horror, stood still and looked him straight in the eye, saying nothing. His hands released their hold on the habit, and with an exclamation that was like the snarl of a beaten animal, he turned and strode out of the convent. Joanna had conquered, but she knew it was not for long. As she knelt trembling in the chapel, thanking God that her brother had left without doing more harm, she was troubled to think of the worry she had brought upon the community. Some of the sisters were frankly terrified, as it was a serious thing to fall under the disfavor of royalty. She prayed fervently that peace might descend on the house, and then, going out, she sought Sister Lenora. She, too, was still trembling from the recent interview, but she smiled at her friend. "Mother Prioress thinks you would like a walk in the garden," she said, "and I am to keep you company." "Mother Prioress is very kind," said Sister Joanna. "I would be very glad to go." They walked through the cloister where Juan had so recently wakened the startled echoes, and went out into the grape arbor. It was bare now, but warmed by a little pale sunlight. Joanna, who loved the garden, had often found there comfort and strength. Had not the dear Christ fled to a garden when His great sorrow was upon Him? "I should be pleased if you told me the story of Blessed Diana d'Andalo," she said. "I need to remember her courage." Sister Lenora was not surprised, for she knew that to her friend the saints were as real as the living people around her. "Diana was a brave girl," she said by way of beginning. "If our arbor were in leaf we could forget this Portugal in winter, and pretend we were in Bologna in spring." Sister Joanna leaned her head against the lattice and closed her eyes, and listened as her friend went on with the familiar story. Diana's father was a wealthy and influential man of Bologna, and Diana was very beautiful, his greatest joy. She was fabulously gowned, she wore jewels that all Italy could envy, and she was, for all her goodness, rather vain of her beauty. One day to Bologna came the friars preachers. They wanted a church, the Church of St. Nicholas of the Vineyards, but Diana's father held the property and would not release it. Diana went to hear the friars preach, as everyone went to hear them preach, and when she came home she put away her silks and her jewels and wept for her vanity. After that she went often, in sober garments, to hear the preachers, and learning of their desire for the church, she added her arguments to theirs. Either the arguments or her smile melted the heart of her father, and he gave them the church. Sister Lenora paused and looked at her friend. She had not moved, but her face was radiant. The church was not enough, she continued, for they were master thieves, those preachers. They took not only the church from the old Count, but his daughter as well. For Diana had watched them daily from her window as the convent of the preachers was in building near by. She told them she would never rest until there was also a convent for Dominican nuns in Bologna, where she could herself serve God. But that would be a long time yet, and Diana could not wait. She wanted so very much to dedicate herself to God. So one day she threw herself at the feet of the friars and begged to be given the habit. They cut off her beautiful hair, and laid aside her jewels, and robed her in the black and white habit, and Diana thought she was already in heaven. Sister Joanna smiled, as though she thoroughly understood. And Sister Lenora continued. But Diana had a brother who was short of temper and most unreasonable. He came riding in full armor to the convent where his sister was staying until the Dominican convent should be built, and he told her to come home. Diana refused, and he carried her out bodily, injuring her seriously in the struggle, but he did not break her resolution, and she did die a Dominican. "And she did not give up," said Joanna quietly. "She was not afraid to suffer for what she knew was the will of God." "No," said Sister Lenora, looking with love and admiration at her friend, "she was not afraid to suffer." End of Chapter 4. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 5 of A Crown for Joanna by Sister Mary Jean Dorsey, O.P. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5 Thorns for a Crown. It surely seemed for the next few months as if fortune were against Joanna. Juan had hardly departed from the convent when a far graver danger threatened — plague. Portugal had great cause to fear the plague, because her long sea coast left her vulnerable to every disease that could be carried by ships. The terrible Black Death of the preceding century had decimated the little kingdom on the peninsula. Whole cities were wiped out, families disappeared from the face of the earth. Each time that another plague had broken out since then, Portugal had shivered in horror. Aveiro was considered a dangerous place because it was near the sea, and both low and marshy. At the first rumors of plague, a deputation arrived to take Joanna back to the court, where she would be safer. What they saw when they reached Aveiro confirmed their worst fears, for the princess was seriously ill. She had had a fever some months before, and the nervous strain attendant upon Juan's visit had further lowered her physical resistance to illness. The doctors shook their heads and scolded, and ventured the opinion that unless she were taken out of the convent permanently, she would pay for her folly with her life. Too weak to protest, Joanna was placed in a litter and carried home to Lisbon. But the plague passed by, inflicting little harm. With Juan away on business of his own, Alfonso had no one to bolster his arguments to keep the princess at the court. The fever had in no way damaged her powers of persuasion, and as soon as the roads were open she was on her way back to Aveiro. Pale and very much afflicted by her illness, she was still radiantly happy to be back with the sisters again. There was always that gnawing fear that somehow some one would destroy her quiet life at Aveiro and place her once more in the midst of the court. For a little while there was peace. Sister Joanna, to her intense delight, was able to go about her business in the monastery without Aunt Philippa annoying her from without, or her father's pleadings troubling her from within. She learned to do the thousand small tasks of a convent, tasks that the princess was not expected to know how to do: washing, sweeping, sewing, carrying wood and water, spinning and weaving. She became very adept at the spinning of flax for the fine threads that went into altar linens. Perhaps her love for the Blessed Sacrament gave unusual skill to her fingers in this work. At any rate, she loved it, and she excelled in it. "Sometimes," she would confide to Sister Leonora, "I am almost afraid. It is too beautiful to last. I do not deserve such happiness, nor the joy of having such sweet sisters around me. When I was little, I longed for a sister of my very own. Now I have many. I prayed to be allowed to dedicate myself to Christ, and now I live under the same roof with Him. I do not deserve all this, nor the joy of making the very linens for Him to rest upon." Sister Leonora was a practical person. "Don't worry over it, little sister," she would say. "I dare say you haven't that crown of thorns on your crest for nothing. You will suffer, probably more than enough before you are through with it. So enjoy what happiness comes your way. There will be enough of sorrow." One thing troubled Sister Joanna's humility. This was, that despite her best efforts, the sisters still looked upon her as their princess. On the lovely illuminated scroll outside the chapel door, where the choir offices were posted for the week, she would be listed as Sister Joanna, Crown Princess. "But I am not the Crown Princess, Reverend Mother," she would beg tearfully. "I'm only the novice Sister Joanna, and the only crown I ever shall wear is the crown of thorns." Mother Prioress could only answer this with a sympathetic smile. The reverence for royalty was deep in the hearts of the Portuguese people. It would never do to forget that. Neither would it do to tell this young girl how much they all loved and admired her for what she was, apart from her royal blood. And if it were a humiliation for her, well, humiliations were good for the soul. Did not one enter the religious life to work on the most excellent virtue of humility? There is always in community life a great opportunity for cultivating virtue. That is, indeed, the reason for its being. But Sister Joanna was not content with these circumstantial opportunities. She had determined to be a saint, which is an uncomfortable but necessary decision if we would reach heaven. She went out of her way to find opportunities for practicing virtue. "Be ye perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect," was a command she did not feel she could ignore. So at the beginning of her novitiate she wrote out for herself a set of 3 rules. At first reading, these do not seem to be very exacting, but following them gave her many occasions of acquiring virtue. First, she pledged herself to "continual care to advance in perfection." That, to be sure, is the end of all religious life. But it is possible to keep a rule, even quite exactly, and to the letter, without putting into the practice the love of God, that would make it a means of advancement. That she would never, even in very little things, allow of any resting on the oars; every action must be a stroke forward. Secondly, she determined on faithfulness to silence and prayer. The two are not necessarily the same, she knew. Silence can be a shutting out of God as well as it can be a union with Him. Joanna's use of silence and prayer would be that of the holy founder Dominic, whose conversation was either with God or about God. For that fruitful silence she was determined to strive. The third rule is the shortest and the hardest: never to refuse God anything. Never is a big word. It covers little emergencies as well as big ones, little matters of one's own opinion as well as big affairs of real sacrifice. Observing her rule with the help of these three little resolutions, which seemed to be fitted to her own needs and personality, Joanna had set her eyes upon the heights and placed her feet upon the steep road leading upwards. Very soon into the tranquillity of her days fell a jarring note. It was only a rumor, but one from which she took warning. The nobles of Portugal were writing again, and this time their destination was not Lisbon, but Aveiro. It indicated that their business had directly to do with the princess, and that they had determined on a final course of action. Joanna was not blind to the state of affairs in the kingdom. While the throne was rightfully to be Juan's, and after him his son's, her title to it was still clear if Juan should die. Juan's infant son had died recently, leaving no claimant in the direct line. The nobles of Portugal, who had once pledged their fealty to her as the rightful heir, had no intention of letting the crown pass to Castile if Juan should die. Juan had other interests. In order to gain his point of getting his sister out of the convent, he had cast his lot with the nobles. But his object was very probably to get her safely married to a foreigner, thus leaving the throne for his own heirs. While Alfonso lived, there was naturally no question of who would rule, but one had to look ahead. A sister with clear title to the throne, resident in the country, and unmarried, was a constant threat to a younger brother, who was moreover none too popular with the nobles. So Joanna realized the seriousness of the situation when a messenger brought the unwelcome news that a delegation was approaching. Very shortly the party reached Aveiro, and followed the winding streets up to the gate of the Convent of Jesus. The yard was loud with the clank of steel and the pawing of tired horses, and bright with the silken banners of every noble house in Portugal. Joanna stood praying at an upstairs window, trying to fathom their intentions. Perhaps they had come to take her out bodily, like the angry brother of the brave Diana de Landolo. Perhaps they were angry enough to turn the sisters out and demolish the monastery. Such things had happened. "Joanna!" called a voice. She turned. It was Juan again, and there was a look of triumph on his face. "Come down to the chapel at once," he said curtly. Joanna was aware, as she walked into the chapel, that all the nobility of the kingdom was ringed about her. It was no time to reflect on the bravery and the power they represented. She loved her people, and her blood still thrilled to the sight of these men who were so brave in battle, so quick to take fire, and so impulsively ready to forgive. So much, in fact, a part of her own heart. The prioress and novice mistress came to meet her, and walked with her up the long aisle. She faced the assembly silently, and waited for someone to speak. Her father stood in the sanctuary between Juan and Aunt Philippa, but he stood sadly, looking at the floor. It was obviously not of his doing that he was present. The Bishop of Evora stepped forward and handed her a long declaration, lettered elaborately on a parchment. "We are here to witness your signature," he said bluntly. An attendant stepped up with an inkwell and a plumed pen. "Lay it on the altar and sign it," prompted an archbishop. Joanna looked from one unsympathetic face to another. No friendly eyes were to be seen. Her father was looking away from her, lest, with one glance at her misery, his resolution should waver. "Don't keep us waiting," said Juan harshly. "Sign!" Joanna drew herself up to her full height, and her eyes flashed. "No princess is obliged to sign a document she has not read," she said. They stood restively while she read the long document. They had half hoped to intimidate her into signing without reading it. But read it she did, slowly and thoughtfully. "That I will never make solemn profession of vows," she read. "That if I do pronounce such vows, they shall be null and void because of this document herewith signed with my name and seal." "I will never sign that," she said, laying down the parchment. "I am afraid that your Majesty needs to recall the virtue of obedience," said the Bishop of Evora. Joanna paled, but did not lose her composure. "I will speak to my confessor," she said. St. Anthony of St. Mary, the confessor, was called, and they discussed the matter for some time. Joanna was determined not to give up what she felt to be the will of God for what were purely human motives on the part of her brother. She did not mind opposing the nobles of Portugal nor her brother, for they had no real authority over her. Her father, she was sure, could be won to her side in a few minutes' conversation, for he was obviously ashamed of the whole thing. But it put the affair in a different light to be commanded to sign the document by the bishops of the Church. Doubtless some persuasion had been brought to bear upon them in their decision to support Juan, but Joanna had too much reverence for the Church to defy them. So in the end, with many tears, she did sign the promise. She reached the very depths of sorrow when, a few minutes later, she was deprived of the religious habit. She knelt before the altar, desolate with sorrow, but resigned to what seemed to be God's will. Piece by piece she removed the beloved habit, and folding it carefully, kissed it with deep emotion, and laid it on the altar. Her own robes were put on her, and she wept bitterly. It was the sight of her tears that preserved her from further indignities, for Alfonso could not bear to see her cry. The plan had been to take her home to the court, but he made a belated stand in the princess's defense. "Let her alone. She has lost enough." There was nothing else they could do, so they went away and left her there. Joanna knelt alone in the sanctuary, her face hidden in her hands, weeping silently. She felt as though her heart had been torn from her and laid upon the altar, where the black and white habit still rested as a symbol of her sacrifice. "I promised never to refuse you anything, dear God," she said. "You ask all that is dear to me, all that I love. I give it, but you must give me in return more love of you." End of Chapter 5. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 6 of A Crown for Joanna by Sister Mary Jean Dorsey, O.P. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 6 The Glory of the King's Daughter. Over all the peninsula there was a nameless terror. It had struck with no warning. The skies at noon had suddenly darkened to an eerie blackness, and when the darkness had lifted, the whole land was in a hush of fear. True, some of the priest professors at the University of Salamanca had prophesied that this would happen, but anyone would know that the occurrence was supernatural. At least, so reasoned the people who huddled in frightened groups in the streets or sought out the churches for prayer. The people of Vivero, no less appalled than any one else, had at least a friend to whom they could confidently go for words of comfort. They gathered in hushed terror at the convent of Jesus, where their princess and suzerain so often met them to dispense justice or to give spiritual help. From that same small convent room, not many weeks before, had gone out Joanna's orders to release all the Moorish slaves in Overo, and her plans for their religious instruction. Now it was only to be expected that in their fright they should go once more to Joanna. Was the sun to darken forever? What awful tragedy did this portend for Portugal? Was it really the day of doom? With these and other eager questions they besought her counsel. "Perhaps we need all of us to do penance," said Joanna very gravely. "We are all sinners. There is no need to look for the guilt of any one person. We have all of us many sins to atone for." "Not you, Princess Joanna, not you," protested an old peasant. "More likely it is you will pardon me, selfishness of your brother, who does not want to give you to God. Perhaps that has called upon us this curse of darkness." Joanna smiled faintly. "There would be just as many to say it was my fault for refusing a throne," she said. "No, good people, let us forget about any one else's guilt and remember our own." "It is like the terrible darkness on the earth when the Lord was crucified," whispered a frightened man. "Do you suppose that, somewhere, something terrible is happening, and this is God's way of showing it?" "It could be God's way of reminding us of the price His Son has paid for our sins," said Joanna. "So often we forget." "Surely you must admit that Donna Guiomar, who is so very wicked, must have had something to do with it," cried a woman in the crowd. "The way she defied you when you tried to make her mend her ways, the scandal she gave here in Overo, the—" "No," said Joanna, looking very sad. We could not blame any one. Besides, Donna Guilmore has gone away from Rivero now, and we should pray for her instead of condemning her. She is no more to blame for this than any one else. We must pray for her and leave her to God." "But the dark," sobbed a frightened woman, holding up a whimpering baby to look at Joanna through the grill. "The awful dark at noon." "It did not last very long," comforted Joanna, "and now it is light again." "But it must be a warning of great evil to come," protested a woman hysterically. "It is more likely a time for us to remember that God is our Father and our help in all things," said Joanna, "for He is my God and my Savior. He is my protector." "He has cast us off and forgotten us," insisted the woman. "Some great evil will come to us. I know it. I can feel it coming." Joanna's solution was simple and characteristic. "Let us all say an act of sorrow for our sins," she said, "and then say the rosary, so that the sweet Mother of God will take care of us." Excitement from the eclipse was slow in dying down, and while it was still fresh in the memory, events began to give credence to the prophecy of evil days to come. First it was the disastrous war with Castile, whose throne Alfonso coveted. His neighbor monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, had put the Portuguese to flight 2 years before, but the bitter fruits of defeat did not become apparent for some time. And hard on the heels of this military calamity came another, the plague. From one end of the peninsula to the other echoed the penitential tones of the Miserere. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to thy great mercy, for I know my iniquity, and my sin is always before me." Portugal was on its knees, brought there, like many a proud kingdom, by national disaster. For this time the plague had struck in earnest, and every corner of the country had seen its deadly shadow. The markets of Lisbon were deserted. No songs echoed from the vine-clad hills of Oporto. The sardine fleet lay at anchor at Aveiro. Plague and fear of the plague had paralyzed the land. Joanna, who with 6 other religious had been brought to the court at the first outbreak of the disease, was spokesman for her afflicted people when she chanted in the Psalms the ancient appeal for mercy: "O God, my God, look upon me. Why hast thou forsaken me? Turn to me, O Lord, and deliver my soul. O save me for thy mercy's sake. For though I should walk in the midst of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art mine. Protect me under the shadow of thy wings." For once not even Juan had any objection to her long hours of prayer. Portugal's need was very great. During the years of plague, while Joanna and her sisters lived quietly at the court, Alfonso died. The throne passed to Juan, who had more and more assumed the reins of government in the last years when his father's broken spirit had kept him from public life. Juan had many problems to settle in his new capacity. One of them was the disposal of his sister. Joanna's determination to remain a religious was by now no secret either to Juan or to the kingdom. For a brief time after signing the document forbidding her to make solemn vows, she had worn her robes of state as a gesture of conformity to the will of the kingdom. Then she had once again put on the religious habit, declaring that she would wear it until death. Juan had no doubts that she would try to do so. But he also had theories of ways and means to conquer her determination. The best of these was still an advantageous marriage. It was not long before the king found a place where Joanna should fit into his plans. It is hard to imagine that even he would have fiancé his sister to a man like Richard III of England, who had usurped his throne by murder and trickery, and was thoroughly hated by all of Europe. But Juan saw advantage in an alliance with England, so he sent Joanna a blunt message to come home and prepare to go to England. Joanna went to the court because one could not simply ignore an edict of the king, but she told him firmly that she would not marry Richard, for the very good reason that Richard was dead. It took only a short while for a messenger to verify this, for Richard had been killed on the field of battle. There was still an English prince, heir to the uneasy throne. Juan began negotiations immediately. However, the plans came to nothing, and Joanna returned to the convent. Forbidden to make solemn vows, Joanna still wished to consecrate her practice of poverty, chastity, and obedience by simple profession. She pronounced her vows on the feast of St. Catherine of Siena, the little sister saint of far off Italy, who through the years had come to be very dear to Sister Joanna of Aveiro. Now linked by the common bond of the vows to all the saints and blesseds of the order, Joanna tasted even more deeply the sweetness of the joy which the world can neither give nor take away. Outwardly she was vexed with 1,000 small irritations, many of them of Juan's manufacture. Interiorly her spirit was very greatly at peace. The king turned to the matter of increasing his own power in the kingdom. He made severe laws, centering the government more and more in his own hands. In order to do this, he had from time to time to kill a troublesome noble. He did not even hesitate to get rid of a bishop who stood in his way. After Juan had been following this policy of disposing of all rivals for some years, he became aware of a real threat to his position. The nobles had determined to place Joanna on the throne simply out of hatred for him. He cast about for a good way to get Joanna out of the country. Receiving some encouragement from the French, he sent for Joanna. Once more the princess made the long dusty trip to her father's castle. Restless and disturbed as her life had been with its disputes over the throne, the years at Aveiro had been peaceful and happy ones in the service of the Lord. Unscarred by sin or dissipation, her extraordinary beauty was even more remarkable at 37 than it had been at 19, when once before the French had come seeking her hand. The ambassadors were properly impressed by that fact, though a little wary of bringing so much piety into their court. But the negotiations failed because Joanna told her brother flatly and finally that she would not marry. Urgent messages reached the French from their own court at the moment, and their enthusiasm cooled. Juan angrily bade his sister good-bye, and she very gratefully started home to Aveiro. It was late autumn, and the hills were golden and heavy with the harvest. Joanna rode in silence through the familiar countryside, drinking in its beauty as though she had never seen it before, and might never see it again. Dusty and tired, they rode into a town and paused for a meal. Unknown to Joanna, there was living in the town Donna Guimar, the woman who had been driven from Aveiro some years before because she refused to amend her evil life. She had nursed her resentment all these years. On hearing that the princess was one of the party, she decided quickly on a method of accomplishing her wicked wishes. She poisoned the princess's food. Joanna had scarcely eaten the food when she realized that it had been poisoned. In great pain she continued the journey, and now the hills and their golden harvest held a different meaning for her. Harvest time had come in her life. She would never ride that way again. End of Chapter 6. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 7 of A Crown for Joanna by Sister Mary Jean Dorsey, O.P. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 7. Crowns. Death was slow to claim the victim he had marked for his own on a highway golden with autumn. The princess lingered in fearful pain as November passed and the first snows fell. There was in her heart no bitterness as she thought of the woman who had deliberately caused her this pain. She was wise enough and holy enough to see that God can make use of very strange instruments to carve out souls to a beauty worthy of heaven. Joanna waited with anxious heart for Christmas. Always a favorite feast, it seemed to her even lovelier this year, when, for the last time, she would prepare for the coming of the Savior. The weeks of Advent she passed in prayerful expectation. In a special way she could hope to see, very soon, the Lord and King for whom she had spurned all earthly thrones. "In the morning you shall see His glory." This promise from the Mass of the Vigil of Christmas was symbolic of the morning of joy she could expect after the dark night of suffering. But in the meantime there was night. All her life she had treasured a devotion to the crown of thorns, since the day when her baby fingers learned to hold the needle and work the simplest of embroideries. She had carefully marked all her clothing and possessions with this device. So it was fitting that at the end of her life she could feel the weight of those thorns, before receiving the crown of glory. Thus she reasoned with the sisters when they sympathized with her sufferings. "You are so patient, Sister," Sister Lenora protested one day. "I don't know why you don't complain, at least once in a while." "Did our Lord complain because His thorns hurt?" asked the Princess mildly. "No," Sister Lenora admitted, "but most of us are not brave enough to keep from complaining all the time. We hardly know you are suffering." "Why should you?" asked Joanna. "It's my cross. God does not ask that others carry it for me. I pray only that I can persevere, and that my love for Him will never waver. I am such a sinner and so weak when it comes to real sacrifice." Sister Lenora looked her doubt at the last remark. "I wish you would at least tell us when you are suffering so much," she said. "It wouldn't help, dear sister," the Princess said with a smile. "I long ago undertook to suffer for the love of God. Why should I object if He has taken me at my word? A holy priest years ago when I was a tiny child told me, 'Child, it costs to go to heaven.' So I expect it to cost, and as long as He has suffered so much for me, why should I refuse the same cup of sorrow?" "If you would only go to bed, and let us take care of you," Sister Lenore persisted. "Soon enough I shall have to," Sister Joanna replied regretfully. "Then I shall be a trouble to you. No, rather, I shall have to depend on your sweet charity to care for me. But now, while I still can get around, I must not miss one chance of acquiring a little merit for heaven. Life is so very brief, Lenora, so very brief. Only eternity is long." "Of course you are right," admitted her friend, "but I wish I could be as patient as you are." Sister Joanna's eyes twinkled with something of their old spirit. "Tell me, Sister Lenora, do you remember the story of our great St. Peter Martyr, when he was punished for a crime of which he was not at all guilty?" "Yes," said her friend, slightly puzzled. "Why?" "What did he say to Our Lord as he knelt in tears before the crucifix?" she asked. "He said, 'Lord, Thou knowest that I am innocent. Why dost Thou permit them to condemn me?'" "And the crucifix, Lenora, what did our Lord say?" "Our Lord answered through the crucifix, 'And I, Peter, what have I done that they should do this to me?'" Joanna smiled. "So you see, sister, I mustn't complain, not when I so richly deserve all that I have of pain. He didn't complain." On Christmas Eve, despite her pain, Sister Joanna was in her usual place in chapel for Compline. Unable to walk in the procession with the community, she sat quietly in her place, watching it. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae. She had always loved the Salve procession. It was a beautiful sight when the Sisters left the high stalls and stepped two by two into the aisle and went singing down the long chapel. The habits flashed white in the shadows. The torches flickered like twin flames of faith and hope in the murk of the world's darkness. But even aside from its outward beauty, the Salve procession was dear to every Dominican for a far greater reason. It was the family battle cry, "Hail, Holy Queen," the daily tribute of an order that loved Our Lady with an undying love. It was, furthermore, the song of triumph with which a dying Dominican, priest, brother, or sister, quitted this earth and went singing into the presence of his Queen to beg her clemency at the throne of her Son. Through a mist of tears, Joanna watched the white habits flicker past in the shadows, and followed in her heart the words she was too weak to sing: "Vita dulcedo, espes nostra, salve." Our life, our sweetness, and our hope. Her thoughts drifted back to the story of the Salve Regina in far off Sandomir in Poland, where 49 Dominicans had sung it as they marched down the aisle to death at the hands of the Tartars. There had been blood and terror and smoke and the crash of falling walls and the wild cries of a bloodthirsty horde. Here was only peace and the quiet, shadowy chapel, and the clear voices of the Sisters singing. But it was the same hymn, awakening memories like the fragrance of flowers, and soon it would be sung about her bed as she bade farewell to earth and its kingdoms forever. "Make me brave, sweet Mother," she prayed. "Let me be courageous enough to suffer much for your Son." At midnight again the Sisters helped the dying Princess to the chapel for the Matins and Mass of the Nativity. She listened with a happy heart to the invitatory: "Come, let us praise the Lord with joy. Let us joyfully sing to God our Savior." The psalms of this feast seemed to have been chosen especially for her, as she formed the familiar words with her lips and thought happily of their meaning. "Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever." Not, she said to herself, as an earthly throne that falls with intrigue or a false move. One would think her forever mad to have refused the thrones of half of Europe. He could never be made to understand about the throne she had chosen in heaven. "Hearken, O daughter, and see, and incline thy ear, and forget thy people and thy father's house." That was from Psalm 44, chanted at the profession of Sisters, when they vowed to leave their father's house for the house of God. "The kings of Tharsis and the islands shall offer presents. The kings of the Arabians and of Saba shall bring gifts, and all the kings of the earth shall adore him." Greater than all the kings of earth was the king she had chosen. The lesson reader began the chanting of the lessons in the solemn tone of the Nativity: "Consolamini, consolamini." It was piercing sweet, sad, and yet more deeply joyful than anything she had ever heard. One phrase seemed to come out from the rest of the lesson to engage her attention. "Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the wilderness the path of our Lord." That was where the suffering came in. One must not resist when the Lord made straight the crookedness and unevenness of one's heart. Pain was a leveler, a straightener, a herald of one who was to come. The Christmas Mass was the last one which Joanna was able to attend before she was forced to bed for months of suffering. She felt keenly the sorrow of not being able to assist at Mass, and also the separation from her community which she loved very much. This she could offer in union with the abandonment of Christ on the cross. Very soon came another torture which was reminiscent of the Passion. A terrible thirst possessed her, and a doctor, doing his best to relieve her in an age when almost nothing was known about medicine, forbade her to take any water at all. "Once I promised never to refuse him anything," Joanna whispered to Sister Lenora. "So, if he asks this, I must not refuse it. He did not refuse the thirst on the cross." For Joanna the cruel suffering of thirst was the final purification of her soul. She bore it silently and without complaint. Even when her lips were so swollen she could barely whisper. She did not question the doctor's judgment. If her divine spouse needed one last assurance of her obedience, this served well. Princesses were more accustomed to rule than to obey. It was a final chance to submit her will to another's. "The Sisters are praying that the pain will lessen," said Sister Lenora one day. "Oh, tell them not to do that," begged Joanna. "Only ask them to pray that I will be faithful. I will see him soon, soon." On the feast of St. John of the Latin Gate, Mass was said in Joanna's room, and for the last time she received Communion. A few days later, as quietly as she had wished to live, she quitted the earth and hurried off to heaven. Around her were not the attendants of kings, but her community singing the Salve Regina. With the detachment of a religious and the dignity of a queen, so says the old chronicle, she left the world which had given her so many trials and received a throne everlasting. Far away in Lisbon the royal chaplain, kneeling at prayer, was startled to see in the air before him a bright and shining crown. It was radiant with gold and with jewels like rubies, scintillating and gleaming like no jewels of earth. As he puzzled over what it might mean, he heard through the quiet night the far-off tolling of a bell. There was a short silence, and a nearer bell began to toll. Then the huge bell of the cathedral, the deep-toned bell in the friars' church, the smaller bells of the convents in the valley. One picked up from another the doleful tidings, and just as the messenger rode into the castle courtyard, the bell of the castle began slowly and solemnly to tell the news of the princess's death. "Joanna at last has a throne and a crown," the chaplain said to himself as he went to the window, "and a scepter that will never fall from her hands." He watched as candles gleamed here and there in the castle windows, and torches flared in the courtyard and in the cottages of the poor. "Rich and poor will look to her. Heaven itself will pay her homage," he said softly. "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, and precious in the sight of God is the death of His saints." End of Chapter 7. Recording by Maria Therese. Epilogue of A Crown for Joanna by Sister Mary Jean Dorsey, O.P. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. The Marketplace, 1490. The bells rang once more for Joanna. Once they had clanged joyously, tumbling over one another to ring out the joyful message of her birth, but now they tolled slowly and sadly, as for the last time Joanna came home to Lisbon. All the city had suspended work for the day. The fisher folk stood on the flat roofs of the nearest market, watching and listening from afar to what the nobles were doing. "She never wanted to come back," said old Rosa to nobody in particular. "She wanted to stay at Aveiro, to be buried under the feet of her sisters." "But that is nonsense, Rosa," said George, the charcoal merchant. "She is a princess. Princesses must always be buried fittingly, as royalty. Those nuns are poor. In life they are poor, in death they are poorer. It wouldn't be fitting to bury her with them." "That is not so that in death they are poorer," Rosa challenged him. "At death they become rich, very rich. She was so good. She has much merit stored up for eternity. That makes riches when she gets to heaven." "Was she a saint, grandmother?" asked the little girl. "Saints are in the church, on the wall." scoffed the little boy. "They aren't people." "No, no, Manuelito." Rosa was shocked. "Saints are flesh and blood like you and me," she cried, "after they are dead and gone. Yes, people paint pictures of them on the walls of churches, so that others may remember their holy lives. But they are real people when they are alive." "Like me, grandmother?" asked the little girl again. "Yes, something like you, Rosita," said Rosa, "only much better behaved, very obedient, very truthful, very prayerful. You will have to work hard to be a saint, Rosita. You had better begin." "Grandmother, did the Princess work hard to be a saint?" asked Rosita. "Princesses don't work hard, George told me, and it must be true." "Not work with the hands, little one," said Rosa. "Work with the heart. At least," she sighed, "that is what Padre Gregorio says, and he is very holy, so it must be so." "You can hear the castle bell quite clearly here," observed the neighbor. "Remember the bells that rang when Joanna was born?" asked George. "Indeed I do," said Rosa. "The town was swarming with great folk, and not a tap of work did any of us do that day, I'm sure. And there was a good catch, too." "The world has changed since those days," said George. "Sometimes I wonder what it is coming to, with all our good ships sailing out into the ocean, looking for riches they will never find." "They'll never come back, either," grumbled a neighbor darkly. "King Juan, he is just like Prince Henry, always curious for far away places, and not caring at all about the things under his very nose." "Bartholomew Diaz came back," reminded another neighbor. "He has done a great deal to enrich Portugal, because his Cape of Good Hope is the promise of empires we shall have some day." "After we're dead and gone," added another. "A lot of good it will do us, an empire we'll never see." "That's all the more reason why Joanna was right," said Rosa. "She didn't set her heart on an earthly kingdom, but on one she was sure of keeping once she got there. Padre Gregorio says—" The men went on talking about explorations, heedless of Padre Gregorio. "That Vasco da Gama will never rest until he, too, gets the money and the ships for an expedition, so that he can hunt for a route to the land of the Great Khan." "Who's the Great Khan, grandmother?" asked Rosita. "Are you made of questions?" asked her grandmother, with a sigh. "The country of the Great Khan, as everybody knows, is paved with gold, and the houses glitter with jewels. The people wear beautiful silks like our kings and princesses wear. But no one can go over the caravan route to his land, over the high mountains and the deserts, because of the cruel Turks. So these men try to find a way by water." "They are none of them so crazy as that Cristobal Colon," said George in disgust. "He with his foolish idea of sailing west to find the east. Anybody knows he would fall off when he got out just so far, and then where would he be?" "Some people say he won't," said a neighbor, shaking his head. "They say that the world is round and not at all flat. When I was a boy there was actually a Pope who said that he thought the world was round. And I guess that if our Holy Father says so, there must be something in it." "I hear that this Cristobal Colon is going now to the court of Castile," said George. "Since King Juan would have nothing to do with his schemes, he's going to see what he can get out of the Spanish." "It helps trade when those ships are fitted out," said another man. "And if they find gold there, why, that would be something very great. Gold is a very wicked thing, they say. I wouldn't know, I never had any, but it must do some good." "Not for us," said George. "Only for the rich, and they do not care for us." "You can't say that about Princess Joanna," said Rosa defensively. "Oh, well," said George, "that's different. She was a saint." "If she is a saint, she got that way by being good and obeying God's laws," Rosa maintained. "You aren't born a saint; you have to make yourself one." "Is Princess Joanna going to be on the wall of our church, like St. James and St. John and St. Peter and all the others?" asked Rosita. "We will have to wait and see, little one," said Rosa. "Holy Church decides about these things. But she was very, very good, Rosita. It would be a good idea if you were to try to be something like her, don't you think?" The bells clanged on, and a ripple of excitement passed through the crowd. "They are coming now. They are just past the Friars' Church. They say that all the flowers in her garden withered and faded for grief when they carried her through the cloister yard. They say she is a saint. They say—" No one knew who started the stories. They traveled on the wind. "I'm glad they brought her home," said George quietly, as they watched the procession file past. "She belongs to us here." Rosa shook her head, still disagreeing. "She has gone home, not to Lisbon, but to God, and she does not belong to us now any more. She belongs to heaven and to all the world." End of Epilogue End of A Crown for Joanna by Sister Mary Jean Dorsey, O.P.